Imagine a headline so dull, so devoid of life, that it practically begs you to scroll past it. It's the kind of sentence that feels like it was written by a committee of bureaucrats in a windowless room, dry, clinical, and utterly forgettable. Canada lifts a set of retaliatory tariffs against the United States. On the surface, it sounds like an administrative footnote, a minor bit of housekeeping in the massive, messy ledger of international trade. But if you stop for a moment, if you look past the gray language and listen to the underlying frequency of the leaders involved, you realize that you aren't looking at a routine adjustment. You are looking at a masterclass in strategic maneuvering. This was not some accidental shift in a noisy, chaotic trade war. It was an act of profound deliberation. It was a rare and striking moment where a smaller nation, refusing to be bullied into a corner, reached for the quiet, sharp tools of institutional leverage to effectively force the hand of a neighbor that is significantly larger, significantly louder, and infinitely more unpredictable. If you felt even a small flicker of confusion when you first saw that news break, believe me, you were not alone. To the casual observer, it looked like a retreat. It looked as though Ottawa had finally blinked in a high-stakes game of chicken, offering a concession to ease the pressure. But the reality is exactly the opposite. What appeared to be a surrender was, in fact, a deeply calculated tactical maneuver. It was a move specifically designed to tilt the entire board, altering the balance of power and negotiation before we even reach the next scheduled review of the North American Trade Pact. As I sat with the details of this story, I found myself reflecting on how frequently the world of high-stakes politics hides its most significant meanings beneath thick layers of carefully managed choreography. A tariff is removed over here. A tariff is stubbornly held over there. A press release is dropped at the exact microsecond it will have the most impact. None of this is loud in the way we've come to expect. It doesn't create the kind of explosive, viral confrontation that surges through our digital bloodstream and dominates our social feeds. And yet, if you are willing to look beneath the surface, you will find the hidden architecture of a plan meticulously designed to redefine the incentives for both countries long before the next major trial of continental trade begins. Canada didn't shout, but their actions were exquisitely calculated. They gave Washington just enough of a symbolic win to satisfy the political theater, while simultaneously preserving every single meaningful point of leverage that will actually matter when the real heavy-duty bargaining starts in 2026. This was not a retreat. This was maneuver. Let's pull back the curtain and talk about what officially took place. Canada made the public announcement that it would be removing a wide-reaching set of retaliatory tariffs on American goods. These were primarily consumer items, the kind of retail products that clutter our store shelves and fill our shopping carts, but rarely move the needle on actual national strategy. But here is the critical part, the detail that changes everything. Canada left the tariffs on steel, aluminum, and the automotive industry exactly where they were. They didn't budge an inch on the backbone industries that support the very foundation of the Canadian economy. If you are one of the thousands of people who work in those sectors, if you are the one on the floor of the plant or managing the supply chain, you know that these are not just footnotes in a policy paper. They are the bedrock of entire communities. By keeping those specific tariffs intact, Canada ensured that it kept the pressure applied exactly where it mattered most to the Americans. By lifting the others, the ones on consumer goods, they effectively surrendered nothing of strategic value, all while creating the polished appearance of goodwill and cooperation. This alone would have been a remarkably shrewd bit of recalibration, but the brilliance was in the timing. This move was paired with the first substantive, high-level conversation between the two national leaders in weeks. Almost instantly, the atmospheric pressure changed. The tone shifted. You had a president who had spent the better part of the last few months publicly deriding Canada's trade posture, suddenly pivoting to offer praise for the Prime Minister. Now, we all know that that kind of sudden 180-degree turn rarely comes from a spontaneous change of heart or a sudden burst of friendship. It comes from the cold realization that the person across the table has just handed you a gift, something you can take back to your supporters and sell as a political victory. What Canada offered in that moment was not a white flag. It was an off-ramp. It was a graceful gesture that allowed the president to dial back his aggressive rhetoric without ever having to look like he was the one who backed down first. You can probably already see where this is heading. In the world of power, sometimes the most devastatingly effective move you can make is the one that lets the other person believe the new direction was their idea all along. To truly grasp why this maneuver was so effective, we have to step back and remember the context, the months of escalating tension and economic aggression that led us here. Tariff after tariff had been hurled across the border, striking industries that had operated for decades under the comfortable assumption that North American trade was a settled, permanent structure. Suddenly it wasn't a structure anymore. It was a battlefield. The anxiety wasn't some intellectual concept. It was a physical weight felt by steel workers, auto assemblers, forestry workers, and manufacturers of every stripe long before any diplomat felt the heat. And for many Canadians, the justification for these economic penalties felt entirely untethered from the facts on the ground. When you hear arguments about illicit drug flows being used to justify taxes on steel, and those arguments don't align with a single piece of data coming from the northern border, it creates a profound sense of injustice. It feels like economic pain is being inflicted on working families for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with the work they actually do. If you lived in one of those communities, the fear was immediate and visceral. Instead of meeting that fire with more fire, Canada did something that can only be described as institutional Aikido. They took the raw energy of the dispute and redirected it back into the existing framework of the Trade Pact, the very agreement that the United States itself had championed and signed only a few short years ago. Most of us, and understandably so, assume that trade agreements are like a giant conveyor belt that just keeps moving goods across the border without any friction. But agreements are only as strong as the people who use them. They depend on compliance. The Canadian government realized that a huge number of exporters simply weren't using the mechanisms already available to them, which meant that protections were going unused and leverage was being wasted. By lifting tariffs on goods that already qualified for free movement under the Pact, Canada essentially forced its own exporters back into the rules of the agreement. At the same time, they sent a clear message to Washington. We are aligning ourselves with the architecture of the deal we already made, rather than trying to blow it up. This is where the institutional elegance of the move becomes undeniable. Canada stripped away the tariffs that weren't actually giving them any real power. They reinforced their defenses in the areas that truly mattered, and then they framed the whole thing as a peace offering to ease diplomatic tensions. You can almost hear the quiet, satisfied exhale of a strategist who knows that the mere appearance of a concession often creates far more leverage than a public display of defiance ever could. And if you are watching this from your home tonight, maybe feeling a bit overwhelmed by the complexity of it all, you might be asking, what does this actually have to do with me? It's a fair question. These disputes over trade dynamics can feel incredibly distant until the moment you see the price of a new vehicle skyrocket, or the cost of home renovation materials jump, or you notice your employer hesitating to hire because the economic horizon looks too dark. The truth is that the stability of continental trade is the invisible current that affects every single household in ways that a simple headline can never fully capture. But beneath the spreadsheets and the policy talk, something even deeper was unfolding. If you look at the political landscape across Canada, from Ontario to Quebec to the prairies, you see something that almost never happens. You see leaders who usually spend their time in fierce opposition to one another suddenly finding common ground. That kind of alignment is incredibly rare in a trade conflict. It serves as a loud, clear signal that the pressure being felt by workers in these threatened sectors is real. It is immediate, and it is significant enough to burn right through the usual partisan bickering. When you have a premier who usually champions deregulation and a prime minister who speaks the language of institutional stewardship standing on the exact same strategic footing, it tells you something vital. It tells you that the economic strain being carried by working families is no longer a theoretical debate. It has become a shared political imperative. This recalibration matters because it isn't just a move on a trade board. It is a direct response to the lived reality of people whose entire livelihoods turn on policies made in offices thousands of miles away from where they clock in every morning. It is a way of reminding Washington that the trade pact we both rely on still has teeth, and that Canada intends to follow the rules, even if those rules are inconvenient for an administration that has grown accustomed to using unilateral pressure. Sometimes, the most powerful message you can possibly send is the quiet, stubborn insistence that the system still matters. That isn't being melodramatic. It is the very bedrock upon which cross-border trust is built. To see the full mechanics of this move, you have to look at how exemptions under the Trade Pact actually function. It's a bit technical, but stay with me. Many goods can already cross the border without a single cent of tariffs if they meet very specific requirements. Yet, far fewer exporters than you'd expect actually take advantage of that system. They operate outside of it, sometimes out of habit, sometimes because the paperwork feels like a mountain they don't want to climb. But when Canada mirrors the United States' own exemptions and lifts tariffs only in the categories where the pact already applies, it nudges its own businesses back into a structure that was literally designed to protect them. It's as if a country is finally reminding itself to use the insurance policy it's been paying for all along. And then, of course, there is the matter of timing. The announcement doesn't take effect tomorrow morning. It doesn't take effect next week. It takes effect months into the future. That gap is not an accident. It gives businesses a runway to adapt so they aren't jolted by a sudden shift. But even more importantly, it gives both governments a window of time to talk, to recalibrate, and perhaps even to rebuild a channel of communication that had been frozen solid under the weight of public tension. Timelines always reveal the true intent. In this case, the intent is unmistakable. A delayed implementation suggests a deep confidence that the conversation will continue, that dialogue, rather than further escalation, is the path forward. It's an attempt to bring diplomatic oxygen back into a room that had been slowly suffocating under the heavy smoke of tariff rhetoric. Naturally, the moment the announcement hit the wires, the critics were ready. Across Canada, alarms were raised. There were those who argued that any step back from retaliation would be viewed by Washington as a sign of weakness, an invitation for more bullying. Others feared that even if the strategic sectors like steel and autos are protected for now, they would eventually be exposed to more pressure because Canada had sent a symbolic signal of softening. I want to take those concerns very seriously, because they aren't just political talking points. They reflect a very real, very deep fear that workers in steel plants and auto lines have been living with for months on end. These are communities that have already endured more than their fair share of volatility. When they hear their government is lifting anything, even if it's just a tariff on a retail item, they can't help but wonder if the foundation beneath their feet is starting to shift yet again. But this is where nuance becomes essential. This is where I have to ask you to hold two difficult truths in your mind at the exact same time. Their fear is completely valid, and yet the strategy may still be the right one. That is the incredibly difficult terrain of democratic policymaking. A leader has to protect their citizens, but they also have to avoid getting trapped in a spiral of escalation that ultimately benefits no one and destroys the very things they are trying to save. Sometimes restraint is not a sign of weakness. Sometimes it is the most sophisticated form of long-term defense. It is an attempt to create the space needed for a new kind of negotiation to begin. It is possible to stand like a rock in the sectors that matter while bending like a reed in the areas where bending costs you almost nothing. That is what Canada attempted in this moment, and if you look at the reaction coming out of Washington, it seems the message landed exactly where it was supposed to. There was one specific detail that really captured my attention: the account of the phone call between the two leaders. When the Prime Minister was asked point blank whether the President explicitly said that lifting these tariffs would reopen the door to negotiations, the answer was a single word: yes. In the world of diplomacy, where people usually use 1,000 words to say nothing at all, that kind of simplicity is breathtaking. It suggests that both sides are fully aware that the current stalemate has outlived its usefulness. It suggests that Canada's careful strategic shift gave the president the political opening he was looking for, an opening he was actually willing to use. In politics, openings are everything. They allow leaders to claim they are making progress, even when the underlying structure of the relationship hasn't changed a bit. As you process all of this, I want you to think about the wider consequences. Trade disputes never stay contained within the industries they target. They aren't just about steel or aluminum or cars. They ripple outward, soaking into the entire civic fabric of a nation. They influence inflation, they dictate investment decisions, they sway consumer confidence, and they determine regional employment. They define how stable your job feels when you wake up on a Monday morning. They define how predictable your mortgage payments seem, or how secure your retirement looks in a world that feels increasingly unpredictable. When nations start using tariffs as weapons rather than tools, the rules-based framework that every citizen depends on starts to wobble. And when that steadiness falters, it is the ordinary voter, the person working the shift, the person raising the family, who absorbs the shock long before any politician ever does. If this move by Canada looks modest on the surface, it's only because the power of an institutional move rarely feels the need to announce itself with a trumpet blast. But make no mistake, this moment is the prologue to the 2026 review of the Trade Pact. That review will be a defining moment that will shape continental economics for an entire generation. By positioning itself right now as the reasonable partner, the consistent partner, the partner that knows how to use the rules rather than just throwing them away, Canada is making sure it walks into that review not as a supplicant asking for favors, but as a stabilizing force. In a tumultuous political era, predictability is a form of massive leverage. And when you are negotiating with a neighbor that is larger and often unpredictable, leverage built on a foundation of consistency is the most durable kind there is. What I find especially telling about this whole situation is how the incentives on both sides quietly started to line up without either country having to admit it. The United States was facing its own rising costs in its supply chains and needed a way to cool off a conflict that was starting to bite its own domestic businesses. Canada was facing deep-seated fears in its most vulnerable industries and needed a way to show restraint without looking like they were surrendering. Both sides desperately needed a way to clear a channel of communication that had become clogged with political performance and posturing. The gesture of lifting those non-strategic tariffs provided exactly what was needed. It created an exchange that looked like a concession on the surface, but underneath it functioned like a giant reset button. In the world of high diplomacy, a reset almost never comes with fireworks. It is carried in the quiet, almost invisible readjustment of policy. The human element here is what we can't afford to ignore. For a steel worker in Hamilton or an auto assembler in Windsor, this isn't a game of geopolitical chess. It isn't an intellectual exercise. It is the difference between a sense of security and the creeping, gnawing anxiety that comes with every new tariff headline. These workers have made it incredibly clear that they feel squeezed, not just by the faceless forces of the global market, but by political choices made an hour's flight away. Their leaders have spoken of an ongoing crisis, and even if the rhetoric is sometimes sharper than the raw data, the emotional truth behind that anger deserves to be acknowledged. A country cannot and should not treat its working class as collateral damage in a negotiation between two capital cities. It must treat them as the people whose lives are the most impacted by every single policy shift. This is the ultimate challenge for any democratic government, weighing the legitimate burning anger of workers against the cold, long-term necessity of stable institutions. You have to show empathy to those who feel exposed while simultaneously avoiding any move that might make the conflict even worse. You have to treat diplomacy not as theater for the cameras, but as the slow, disciplined, often boring work of building a path out of escalation. Strategic restraint is almost never satisfying in the short term. It doesn't scratch that itch we all have for immediate retaliation. It doesn't give you the rush of hitting back twice as hard as you were hit. But it is the only thing that lays a foundation for something that will actually last. You might wonder if that foundation will actually hold, and that is a perfectly fair question to ask. If you look at how the United States has treated other trading partners lately, tariffs have become the default setting, the first tool they grab rather than the last resort. From China to Europe, many economies have felt the impact of this shift. In that environment, Canada stands out. It has maintained low average tariff rates and has been a consistent player within the rules. That positioning is incredibly valuable when the global markets are shaking. Companies don't just pick a location based on where things are cheapest, they pick the place where things are the most predictable. When a country signals that it can stay stable even while navigating a conflict, it becomes a magnet for long-term investment. That stability isn't an abstract concept. It determines where the next factory opens, where the next supply chain anchors itself, and where the next community grows. And yet, we have to admit there is a vulnerability here too. If the rules-based system itself starts to erode, even the most compliant partner can find that stability is slipping out of reach. That is why the 2026 review is so important. It isn't just a calendar item. It is a potential turning point for the entire future of North American economic life. You prepare for those moments through strength, through alignment, or through predictability. And Canada has clearly chosen to double down on the latter. Whether that choice is enough when you're negotiating with someone who often values disruption more than infrastructure is a question that is going to follow us all the way to that review. Still, something constructive has emerged from the brief exchange we saw after the leaders spoke. When the Prime Minister confirmed that the President committed to reopening negotiations, the answer came back without any extra fluff. Just, yes. In a world where clarity is rare, that simplicity suggests that both nations realized they were standing a bit too close to the edge and decided to take a step back. It doesn't mean the hard part is over. It doesn't mean there aren't massive hurdles ahead. But it does mean that a necessary tool, dialogue, has reappeared. In trade relations, conversations can freeze up so easily. Thawing them out requires real intention. As we step back and look at the bigger picture, this moment tells us something about the resilience of democratic institutions under extreme pressure. Trade agreements are more than just a way to move money around. They are a commitment to settle our fights through rules rather than through raw force. When nations start using tariffs as political weapons, they are chipping away at the trust that holds those commitments together. That trust is what protects the average person from the kind of abrupt policy shifts that can destabilize an entire town. When the rules hold, people can plan their lives. They can save for their kids' education. They can build a future. When the rules become unpredictable, that scaffolding starts to weaken. Small changes in a tariff rate start to turn into large changes in public confidence. And confidence is the most precious commodity any democracy has. The resilience of these systems depends on leaders who understand that you have to reinforce the institutions, not just mention them in speeches. Bringing Canada back into full alignment with the Trade Pact's mechanisms is more than just a tactical play. It is a signal that the rules still have weight. It is a reminder that agreements don't survive just because they are written on a piece of paper. They survive because nations choose to act as though they matter. And when you see your government reinforcing that framework, it sends a message to every citizen. You live in a system that still believes in an orderly way of doing things, even when the political winds are blowing as hard as they can toward disruption. All of this brings us back to the people who are at the heart of this. When tariffs go up or down, they don't land on a spreadsheet. They land on the worker whose daily routine is dictated by a market they have no control over. They land on the family that is already counting every nickel because of the price of groceries. They land on the small business owner trying to manage an inventory on a razor-thin margin. When a government takes a step to stabilize the trade environment, even if that step looks like a boring technical adjustment, it has a profound effect on the sense of economic security that anchors a community. If you have been watching this conflict unfold with a growing sense of unease, You probably feel at least a little bit of relief seeing the start of a path back toward talking. But that relief is likely tempered by the knowledge that the real work is still ahead of us. In many ways, this moment is a reminder that the health of a rules-based system isn't found in dramatic, loud victories. It's found in steady, quiet, thoughtful decisions that keep the foundation from cracking. Canada's recalibration was one of those decisions. It told its citizens that it will protect the sectors that matter without letting the whole relationship fall into total dysfunction. It told its partner that stability, not spectacle, is going to be the guide as we move toward 2026. Whether this succeeds will depend on whether both countries are willing to admit that cooperation, even when things are tense, offers a lot more security than escalation ever will. This moment captures the very essence of modern democratic governance. Our institutions aren't there to make conflict disappear. They are there to channel that conflict through a framework that keeps society stable. Choosing to de-escalate in one spot so you can stand firm in another isn't always going to feel satisfying. It won't make for a great action movie. But it is exactly how a democracy preserves the space it needs for reason to come back to the table. If you are watching this tonight and wondering what happens next, the honest truth is that no one can say for sure. But we can say this: a line of communication that was shrinking has been reopened. Both nations have been reminded that restraint, when it is used with wisdom, creates a kind of leverage that is much more durable than any shouting match. So, I will leave you with this final thought. In a world that feels like it's becoming more volatile by the hour, a moment of careful, thoughtful calibration is something that is actually worth your time to notice. It tells you that even under immense pressure, it is still possible for leaders to choose strategy over impulse and structure over spectacle. It invites you to think about how your own expectations as a citizen help shape the politics that happen around you. If you found this breakdown helpful, I hope you'll stay engaged with us. Keep asking the big questions, keep looking past the headlines, and consider supporting this channel so we can continue to think through how politics, history, and our institutions are shaping the world you have to navigate every single day.